I am a writer, and I do some training in corporate workplaces around inclusion and emotional intelligence and how we effectively communicate with one another. And my background is in HR, and what's most sort of relevant to all of this discussion is I had a brain injury when I was 8 years old, and that resulted in a physical and developmental disability that I've lived with ever since, and have worked through many different physical challenges. And, one of the things that I really struggled with growing up was understanding my identity as a person with a disability, understanding the sort of intersection between being a woman with a disability, living in a culture, particularly here in the US, where we didn't, people with disabilities at the time weren't on stage or on the screen as much. I didn't
Hi,
see them in
hi.
my day to day. And so really, sort of,
Um,
are we okay? Really, grew up sort of thinking about that. And then in my 20s and 30s, really started to see how that was impacting my dating life, worked through a lot of that, and have now put together this book to really speak to how I worked through understanding who I am as a woman with a disability, what that means for the type of partner I want to date. And I think, what that means for all of us as a society.
I think the notion of dating anyway, Emily, brings up so much questions of shame about who we are. If there's any sort of dominating feature in our mind about who we are, shame really exacerbates it in any dating situation. I really wanted to start by asking you how you first noticed that there was something different.
Yeah. And I love what you said about, because identity is so much more than just one facet, right, of us. And I think when I was growing up, I at times probably over-indexed on the fact that I was single, right? Or I had never kissed someone as, the defining part of my identity. And that, sort of the interesting thing is growing up, I didn't really explore or think about my identity as a person with a disability. And so that's, one thing that I've really enjoyed in the past 7-8 years is really like thinking about all the different facets of my identity, right? I run my own business. I'm a woman. I have a disability. Like to do yoga and so all these different things. But to your point, when I first noticed I was different, so I had this brain injury when I was 8, and after the injury, the surgeons had to go into my brainstem and remove a clot of blood vessels. And that resulted in a loss of speech and partial paralysis on the left side. And so, when I was rehabbing, clearly I was different. It didn't really occur to me that that was a big deal. And it was not something that my therapist or my family talked about with me. And when I was in elementary school, so that was like in second grade, I returned to school in third grade. And at that point, my parents were very much in the mindset that they didn't want me to think of myself as different, even though I clearly was, and walked differently and moved differently. I did regain my speech pretty quickly, which was very lucky. And so I didn't really think of myself as different. But then I think really once I hit sixth grade, I can remember in sixth grade, that was when I first started being interested in boys. And I can remember thinking, oh, wait, why doesn't so and so like me? Like I like them. Is it because I walk different? And so that's really the first time, like in those middle school years, that I started to sort of be cognizant of the fact that I was different and that that might not be a good thing.
And so you noticed that you weren't getting asked out.
Yeah. I was not.
Yeah, but I don't think you were really prepared just to accept the situation as it was. What was it that was different about your, answer that question anyway that seems relevant.
Um, I definitely wasn't prepared. I think, one of the things that's really important to me in my work and in my writing and in my speaking is helping people have difficult conversations, right? And really leaning into emotions, because that was something I didn't do as a child or as a teenager or, as a young adult in my 20s. And that was very detrimental, honestly. Like I think, in addition to that, we had sex ed, quote unquote, in high school, maybe in middle school, and it certainly did not cover anything in the realm of bodies that work differently or minds that work differently, or how to have conversations with people where there are a lot of emotions. And so, no, I was not prepared I didn't know how to handle the fact that I moved differently. I didn't know how to handle the fact that I was starting to have these thoughts of like, is this a good thing? Like, am I worthy of this? Like, and so to kind of put a pin on this, one of the things I do want to do through this book and through the other things that I'm writing is help model for people how you have these conversations, and help model, particularly for young people, that like, it's okay if you're not dating or having sex, like it's okay. And I think that was one of the things I was missing too, is, in the media, it felt like everyone is dating and everyone has, hundreds of crushes chasing after them. And that's not really the case. And I think that, can contribute, the media certainly can contribute to shame and how we feel about ourselves and how we feel we should be dating, etc.
Shame tends to keep people quiet, and what I've noticed in uh, certainly my work is that people end up in shame prison, and what they tend to hide is the only thing that they're not guilty of, or the only thing that they're innocent of. So in your case, your own anatomy wasn't something that you had decided on, but you had to deal with it anyway. Um, were you in shame prison over that?
I was. Yes, I was. And I'll go back to my what I mentioned earlier, my musical that I love. So, Michael, I don't know if you know this. Have you seen the musical Hadestown? It's absolutely fabulous. You should see it. The woman who wrote it, Anais Mitchell is her name, and she talks about one of my favorite songs in it. I was listening to it this morning. It's like she describes, the real thing you need to be afraid of is what's between your ears, behind your eyes. And she says that's the path to paradise or the road to ruin. And I just love that. It's everyone should listen to this, or you can also read the book of the lyrics. It's fabulous. But it's, for me, I was in that shame prison, right? And my head sort of, in a protective fashion, which is nice, was putting me there, if that makes sense. And so I wrote an article a couple of years ago that was published in the LA Times where I talked about this and talked about, I decided, when I was living in California and during the pandemic, I decided I really needed to sort of look at myself and understand what I was doing to not be in the type of dating or romantic relationship I wanted to be in. And I had a phenomenal coach I worked with, and she helped me to realize that I was putting myself in this prison because of how much I wanted to protect myself. But I, had this traumatic thing happen to me physically, didn't know how to deal with it emotionally, didn't have the support to know how to deal with it. And so because of that, just sort of took this approach of like, okay, we're not going to let anyone else hurt us again. And part of that means we're not going to be vulnerable. And that right there is, sort of the antithesis of an intimate relationship, is like, I'm not going to be vulnerable. I'm not going to tell you how I feel, or I'm not going to tell you I want to date you. Um, and I even, saw this, I've talked about this spill over into the workplace, right? I would have very difficult times in the workplace telling, a CEO or telling somebody what I felt or what my opinion was. And that was all sort of the result of this shame prison.
Yeah, I think I think that's very interesting. If we've got something that if if we've got something that we are covering up, we've got one problem that we're covering up. I've got a need, and I maybe fancy somebody, and or I'm being scorned in some way. If I keep that to myself, I stay with my one problem. If I share it with the other person
Mhm.
and they ridicule me for it, or in a dating situation, if I share it and I'm rejected for it, I've got two problems. And what shame says is, you stick with your one problem. Don't risk making it two
Mm.
problems. Don't risk sharing anything with anybody, particularly not where needs or vulnerability comes in. We've all got human needs, but we all somehow convince ourselves that we're the only one who are whose needs are endless or bottomless or different from everybody else's. And when we all cover up the same thing, we all think we're the only one with a problem. But sticking with one problem is the big issue. So, I mean, you and I've spoken about this a couple of times, although each time conversation's gone in a different direction. But I know you broke through it, but how did you break through it?
Uh, it was it was very messy. Also, I'm just gonna say that I have never used that term with somebody of I think I fancy you. So, Michael, I think that's what I'm gonna use the next time I have to have one of these conversations is I think I may fancy you. Um, so the way I broke through it is I mean truly it was not pretty. Oh, thank you for the one person laughing at me. I appreciate that. That was meant to be funny. Um, I had moved to California in 2019, right before the COVID-19 pandemic started. And I didn't know, I knew one person. I didn't know a lot of people. And so because of that, and then because of the pandemic, I was isolated quite a bit and pretty lonely. And the good thing about that is it really forced me to dig into myself, and I started journaling quite a bit. Writing was always something I enjoyed, but hadn't done a lot of since childhood. So yeah, I started digging into it, and I found, like I mentioned, I found this intimacy coach through my yoga studio. Reached out to her. We started working together virtually, and at the time, I think my ask of her was, I've never had a boyfriend, like I really want one. What's going on here? And we started digging into it, and what she really helped me to realize was that a couple of things. I mean, first of all, I was chasing after the wrong people. Second of all, my energy was not where it needed to be to attract the kind of partner I wanted. And third of all, I wasn't really that comfortable with myself, and I wasn't comfortable telling people the truth. And I remember, there's a very specific moment I remember with her where we're on the Zoom call because it was during the pandemic. So we're on Zoom, and I was in San Diego at the time. And uh it's just so funny looking back at this. Michael, you haven't heard the story. We're on the call, and there's some people outside working on the house next door. And of course they couldn't hear me. I mean, they were, next door, doors, windows are shut and everything. And I don't know what she asked me, but the answer was, I've never had sex. And I looked at the camera and I'm like, I've never had sex. And she was like, Emily, like if you can't even say that to me, how are you gonna say that to someone you're dating? And it was so anyway, we're kind of getting off tangent here, but I think that's how I started to break through it, is like admitting to her, you know, what I was quote unquote ashamed of. And then from there, it sort of
But that
spiraled.
is,
Like,
I mean, that is so unusual that it's just this breaking the silence,
yes,
shame busting out of your shame prison by being able to articulate that, just to say it. I
right.
think that's very rare. I mean, I don't know if you think that's rare, but I have not heard many instances of people actually verbalizing the thing that shame is telling them to keep secret.
Agreed. Yeah, it was a big moment. And I think, you know, so then, you know, I agree with that. And if we extrapolate that out, you know, then a year later or so, there was a guy that I was really interested in dating, and I told him the same thing. And I, you know, I remember we were having this conversation, ironically, over coffee one morning, and it came out a lot more easily, right? It was not this like, I'm so ashamed of my lack of sexual experience. It was a very direct, um matter of fact thing, and it was so much easier. And you know, as I look back on this, I think you're spot on that, you know, one of the ways that I was able to get over shame and, you know, take control of my dating life and what I wanted, was to be honest. But that took a lot of sort of emotional courage to be like, I'm going to tell people this thing about myself that I think is really ugly and really unacceptable. And, you know, that's hard because we all have things like that. You know, we all have things like that. And, you know, I remember even in college, my friends, you know, one of my friends in college, I had told her, you know, that, you know, I'd never had sex and I hadn't dated anyone. And she said, I remember she said to me, well, you don't ever have to tell the guy when it's your first time. Like, you don't really have to tell him. And I think that like pushed me back even more, right? This idea of like other people now telling me, keep it locked in, like keep this, whatever
Well,
you're, yeah.
I wanted to ask you about that because I imagine that potential dates or dating partners might have been quite intimidated by you.
I I mean, what I would say to that is if they are, they're probably not the right person for me.
But
Um,
did you experience that sort of uh, that they didn't know how to cope with your directness?
yes. Yeah. I mean, I've experienced that a lot. And it's, you know, it makes me uh sad in a sense. It does make me sad because it's they don't have the resources and tools just like I didn't have them. And I think, you know, one of the big things in this book and in my speaking that, you know, I try and help people with is I was actually talking with a friend yesterday about the book, and he was asking like, you know, what's the difference between it and like some other, there's a great collection of essays that just came out about disability and intimacy. And I said, you know, I don't want to just raise awareness. I want to help people like take action like I did, because yeah, like I can think of somebody I was interested in a couple years ago, and he just, it was too much. Like my directress was just a little too much, and he shut down. And I get that, and I still care about him and love him very much. But you know, I get that, and you know, I don't even, we don't even have to isolate this to romantic relationships. Like I see it with my friends and with my family as well, which is another intimate relationship of, you know, when you are direct and when you have that strong inner game, as you've called it, Michael, it is off-putting to people sometimes.
I think that this was another twist in a conversation we had, but we were talking about the contrast between physical intimacy and conversational intimacy, and
Yeah,
that physical intimacy isn't as challenging or as intimate as actually disclosing things,
yeah,
saying, having conversations that reveals things about
yeah,
yourself. So,
yeah,
I mean, you are somebody who really seems to thrive on intimacy.
yeah. Good.
Um, And I think that that's certainly something that I'm very interested in, as far as your LA Times article is concerned, as far as your book's concerned. And I think what I really admire about that, about what you're doing, is how far it goes to modeling breaking shame down and breaking through these shame prisons and breaking the silence. And you know, even in your voice, I don't know if I'm if I am hearing it, but I'm hearing some emotion, as you were talking about sadness. And
Yeah.
we've talked about crying as well, because shame hates emotion. Shame's an emotion, but it hates emotions.
Yeah.
So it will shut any emotion down. But you don't let it shut you down from crying, for instance.
I don't. I don't. And that was something big I had to learn. And, I think this is another thing that, again, like, it's just very important to me that, like, if I can help anyone who is uncomfortable with something about themselves or unsure, like, help them to get through that, I want to. And, I think emotion, when I was growing up as a child, emotion was not encouraged in my family. And, and I was always very emotional. But it was something I kept locked in. And, in my 20s, I cried a bit, but I remember, like, being in bed at night and my roommate's in the next room and I'm trying to, like, cry quietly. And honestly, like, people who know me on this call, like my good friend Sarah is here and she knows that, when I moved to Santa Monica, I, just sort of was like, forget all of this. And I started crying. I remember one big moment in 2019 in Santa Monica where there was a guy I was interested in and we were in sort of this gray zone and nobody was saying anything. And I had been in those situations quite a bit. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to say something. And before I said something, I was, kind of sitting there. I mean, I'm a writer, right? So I overthink everything I text or write. So I was sitting there's a park in Santa Monica that overlooks the ocean, called the Palisades. And I was sitting there, thinking about what I was going to text to this guy because we were no longer in the same city. And I just started crying. I mean, I just started crying in public. And I remember this man came up to me and was like, "Are you okay?" And I was like, "Actually, I'm fantastic." But yeah, I think one of the things that I've learned about myself is, at times, I think, particularly when I started this journey, I think emotions can seem like a deep, bottomless well, right? At least that's how it felt for me when I started going through this shame journey, and digging into kind of who I am and what my identity was this, like, I would just cry and cry and cry every day, when I lived in San Diego. And now, it's funny because when I feel sadness now, I'm able to bounce back from it a lot quicker, which is a true gift. And I think, is part of the emotional kind of resilience skill set of, like, okay, we're going to feel this and we're going to feel sad and we're going to feel disappointed. We're going to manage it. We're going to be aware of it, then we're going to manage it and we're going to move on to the next emotion.
Yeah. I mean, for me, even doing an event like this brings up some shame in terms of, being visible and telling people about what I'm doing. I think that's why I admire what you're doing so much, because I don't have to give that much away about myself in what I'm writing about. I am having to give something away about myself because I wouldn't understand shame if I didn't have a lot of it myself. But it's why you're a bit of a role model, I would say, Emily. So why it's always interesting having these conversations. But even breaking cover and having a conversation like this brings up those sorts of feelings of, it's safer back in my box. What do you think you're doing? Why do you think you're special?
Right.
So even writing something brings that up for me. And I'm not as, I don't think I'm as brave as you are. And I think that's why I think you're a very good role model.
Well, thank you. But I would also add that I think bravery looks different for everyone, and not everyone needs to be on a Zoom call like I am talking about this stuff. I mean, they just don't. And that's, one of the things that I talk about in workplaces is not everyone is going to be ready or going to want to or should have to be open about their disabilities or their medical histories or things like that. It's just not necessary for everyone, and it's very private information. And I feel like, for me, this is I feel very strongly this is part of why I'm here on this planet, is to be open about my experiences. But that looks different for you, Michael. And I mean, I'm obsessed with your book. I can't wait to read it. And I think it's just, it's coming at the same thing from a different perspective, which I think is helpful. I certainly don't have, the clinical or, therapeutic expertise that you do.
Well, I certainly do hope that, I mean, my book does deal with stories, not my own story, but slightly fictionalized and anonymized, if that's a word, versions of people I've worked with. But certainly in the last section, I do want to deal with shame very directly. And I'm working on ways of, on strategies for shame reduction. So that is certainly, I think, one shared aim that we both have.
We do. Yes, we do. I think I'm seeing a question. Let's see. To Michael, could you share a pivotal moment from your book that highlights the transformative power of confronting shame?
It's a really good question. There is a situation in the book where somebody who suffers really bad anxiety and is looking for help with the anxiety, but they want help with the anxiety without really wanting to look at what lies beneath it. And of course, because the book's about the shame deception, there was a lot of shame behind the anxiety. And the thing that they were most anxious about was not going into their childhood. They really didn't, they wanted to avoid going into any of the stuff about their childhood, but they didn't know, they actually didn't know what they'd been through. But this person walked away from therapy and only came back a year later. And a year later, in the work, we brought his family into it. And it came out that there was no terrible problem. It's funny how shame can arise from really everyday situations. It was just there was a family member who got all the attention because they had the greater problem. So the individual I was working with, his needs were missed. And the thing that he really didn't want to do was to address that. And that's when the deeper emotions, the emotions that were underneath the shame and anxiety really came out. And there's some description of that in the book, but I suppose it was just confronting something. Anxiety is interesting because it sits on top of like shame, it sits on top of so many other things that actually contribute to it. And very often anxiety isn't anxiety, or rather it's anxiety about other things coming to light. And that's what this person really didn't want to come to light. But in family work, so the therapy then changed to family work, it all sort of came out. And Ben in the book thought this was a catastrophe when it all came out. In fact, it was life-saving for him. The catastrophe, the worst thing that could happen, was the transformative thing, the healing thing. But there was so much resistance to it. But anyway, the lid eventually came off, and anxiety, strangely, reduced quite substantially once the story came out.
Yeah. It's the story coming out is so powerful. So messy, so ugly sometimes, but so powerful. I mean, I'm just so thankful every day that I shared my story, you know, and again, not everyone has to do it in the LA Times, but I mean, yeah, sharing like that moment where I shared with that guy who was romantically interested in, when I shared with him one-on-one that I, you know, hadn't had sex, like that was a big moment. I mean, that was very proud of myself. And I, you know, one thing I want to highlight, Michael, just really quickly that you said is, you know, that individual felt like his needs weren't being met. And all of us, right, have needs that aren't met. And I think there's an important component to intimacy with yourself that we haven't touched on. And like, I am super intimate with myself, like I mean, in a lot of ways, but like, particularly with like my self-talk, with spending quality time alone with myself. So I think, you know, that's another thing we could get into in another conversation, but made me think of it. We have a lot of questions. One that I want to just touch on really quickly was, are there any conversation starters you can suggest for beginning talks about emotionally intimate topics? I have one comes to mind pretty quickly, and that is I'm obsessed with Esther Perel. And she is a relationship coach. She's got a podcast about intimacy. She has a fabulous little card game that I have played. And I don't, Sarah may remember the name of it. I can't remember the name of it right now, but it's but you can buy the cards. And I actually went in New York. This is a dating event that some club did. And you know, that you take a card and it asks you a question about like, you know, what's your earliest memory, or when was your first kiss, or something like that. And it's just a fun way to start conversation. The New York Times has published something similar, but like, I think those are easy conversation starters if you're looking to just have some fun with it.
I think, yeah, absolutely. I think self-disclosure can be very disarming for another person, but it'll go one of two ways. Either the other person be absolutely horrified and run a mile, or they will feel challenged to meet your own self-disclosure. But I don't know. I mean, in this country, in Ireland, the UK, people aren't very self-disclosing, and we're not very comfortable with self-disclosure. But it's certainly a very disarming way to start, to try and break down defenses.
It is. It is. You know, the shame really started to manifest because of the lack of representation I was seeing in the media, the lack of interest I was getting from boys in high school, which could be due to a variety of things. The, you know, inability I had to talk about my feelings, inability, you know, the fact that my parents didn't have the tools and resources they needed to help me talk about it, you know. And so I think that really sort of all compounded and manifested in shame, is just not having the tools to talk about anything, not having the role models I needed. And it's hard, you know. I really applaud this person who says they're struggling with the concept of shame, because, you know, I think a lot of us do. And you know, it's even, quite honestly, you know, it's something that like Michael and I say, yes, I do feel like I've gotten to the other side of dealing with shame, but it doesn't mean I don't deal with it. I mean, there are definitely points in time where something will trigger me and I'll think, wait, what? Is he not interested in me because he doesn't want to take care of me as I get older? You know, is he not interested in me because I, you know, can't use two hands? Like, what, you know, what's going on here? But yeah, I think normalizing disabled experiences is going to help societally address some of this, and that's going to take time. If I can do one thing in this life, it's going to be get a movie made with a disabled person having sex on screen. But yeah, I think Yeah, if that's helpful at all, I think that's sort of how the shame manifested and something we can address kind of at a societal level versus individual tools.
Yeah, it's not just society that's hard on us. We've all got inner critics and we're all fairly hard on ourselves. And it's only when you do actually start breaking through that and talking to other people that you realize that we are much nastier to ourselves very often than other people are once we are actually able to break through. So this is something shame doesn't want us to know, that other people are going to much more likely to be compassionate to what you've been through than you are yourself. But shame tells you other people are going to judge you. They're going to criticize you just the way you do to yourself. And so we're all inclined to cover things up more than we need to.
Yes. And this is another excellent point in the chat, is that not everyone with a disability feels shame. And that is 100% true and 100% accurate. And, I think that's really important to keep in mind too, and is not a disability is not a monolith, right? Like, this is my experience and I can speak to my experience, but I can't speak to other people's existences. And, some people with disabilities, have never had the sexual problems, the problems with like sexual intimacy or physical intimacy that I have had. And so that's important to keep in mind. And, somebody actually asked me yesterday in an interview, what was my biggest tip for dating somebody, anyone? And I said, don't make assumptions, right? Like, and that speaks to Carolyn's point, is like, just because this is Emily's experience, not everyone who's had a brain injury is going to have the same experience. Oh, and this, I'm going to call this out. So Bethany just shared, everyone can look at this in the chat. So Carolyn, who's on the call, is also an author and has written The Wiggly Warrior, which is a book about living and thriving in her wiggly body with the roots of her childhood and yoga practice. And this is related to her experience with cerebral palsy. So everyone should check that out too. It's fabulous. I know we're at time. Let's see. Bethany, someone's knocking at my door, so I may need you to take over the chat. I think you're on mute.
All right. Thank you so much, Emily and Michael, for being here and for this really insightful conversation. Michael, if it's okay, I wanted to ask one more question that I had seen come through the chat, if I can find it one more time. It was, let me get back to it here. There was somebody that asked a question about the different types of shame. And
that was me. I deleted it because I thought the other questions were better.
Oh, well, thank you so much for offering it. But if you wanted to elaborate or ask the question, we could certainly take it before we wrap up here.
Yeah, my question is how does shame, it manifests within the body, it manifests within the emotion. Are there different subsections of shame, and how does that work? I've honestly never thought about it.
Well, yeah, there's internal shame and external shame. People with internal shame tend to struggle more with it. So, all of us are subject to external shame. So if I write something and a professor of psychology tells me that I got it completely wrong, I might feel a lot of shame. It might not completely crush me if I'm only subject to external shame. But if I've got a lot of shame going on already inside me, I might never write another word again, because it'll confirm all the sort of shame type beliefs that I have about myself. So there is an important distinction between internal and external shame. I think the other thing that's very interesting in terms, you bring up the body and the anatomy. there's a book called The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist, which seems to suggest that in neurological terms, the left brain, which is the talking brain, has a strategy for shutting down the right brain, which is the emotional brain, so that there is actually a physiological, neurological dimension to shame, where one part of us is physically silencing another part of us. And our right brains can't speak. Our right brains has to pass that over to the left brain in order to do the speaking. So if we're having an emotion and we want to articulate it, shame will shut that down, and it'll use the talking brain to not talk about it or to talk around it. So there are many different components to shame, but I think the overriding one is that shame is a trump card emotion. So, you know, you can have all the full spectrum of emotions, but if you got the shame card, it's going to silence all the other ones. It's just going to shut everything else down. Thank you very much. Emily, we've not been short of things to talk about, and thank you so much, Bethany, for organizing this, and thank you all for coming along.